Hello there, and welcome to the Dear Dyslexic podcast series, brought to you by Rethink Dyslexia, the podcast where we're breaking barriers and doing things differently. I'm Shay Wissell, your host, and I'm so glad you can join us. I'm a fellow neurodivergent, and I'm coming from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I live and work. And I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to all the tribes across our beautiful country and to all First Nations people listening today. Our podcast was born in 2017 out of a need to give a voice to the stories and perspectives of adults with dyslexia. And our voice has grown stronger year after year. We're now a globally listened to podcast with guests from all around the world. Join us for insightful conversations about living with dyslexia and other neurodivergences across all walks of life. Our special focus is on adult education, employment, social and emotional wellbeing, and entrepreneurship. We're excited to be bringing you this episode and invite you to like and follow us, or even better, why not leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. So let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Dear Dyslexic podcast show. Today, I am excited to be talking to Annalisa, who I've been doing a little bit of work with. I think maybe over the last 18 months, we've been doing a couple of different projects together, and we caught up before Christmas and I gave her a copy of my book, and we were talking. I said we really should do a podcast together talking about adulthood neurodivergence. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I don't know, where do we start with this conversation? Well, maybe if you give a little bit of background about the work you do and how you got involved in the neurodivergent space.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I run a company called Atom Consulting, and we do a lot of work, the water utilities, in supporting them in how they manage their risks, particularly with their water quality risks. I became involved in the neurodivergent area as my elder son was diagnosed with autism and being on the autism spectrum. And as part of that, that started to make me become aware that while I'd always sort of joked I had ADHD, that actually was a bit of a trigger to then go and pursue a diagnosis to see whether I really did have it or not, and then whether I would do something about it. So I did pursue that and was diagnosed in my 40s then with ADHD, and chose to go on medication for that and found that really, really effective. My second son was also diagnosed with autism, so we've certainly been very strong and big advocates in this space, having to advocate very heavily for our boys. And then more recently, within the water sector, we're facing a massive skill shortage. And so there just seemed to be a complete disconnect between people who are neurodiverse, who have an incredible range of skills, and the sector with a big skill shortage, and how can we bring these two ideas together and look at how we can tap into the potential of neurodiverse people to help us in addressing the skill shortage that we have. And that was when we connected, organising one of our workshops in Sydney. And that was a fantastic day to bring together the various organisations in the sector and hear from professionals like yourself and others working in this space to support organisations and individuals in understanding and being effective within the neurodiversity and bringing that into the workplace. And then it was actually sort of through meeting you and chatting with you that encouraged me to, I guess it broadened my view of dyslexia. And I think that is one of the challenges with neurodiversity and adult diagnosis around neurodiversity is there's very small understanding, or like the way it's portrayed and communicated to the broader population is actually a very narrow aspect of the broader way it manifests. So I had always thought that dyslexia was merely about words moving around on a page and having those sort of difficulties. I had very early indications of never getting a spelling test right all the way through school, having problems telling left from right. So a lot of things that may be classic indicators, but I wasn't aware of that. And so I only got diagnosed in the last 6 months. So yeah, I think it's been an interesting journey for me to come along and to realise and to come to, I guess, to terms with the fact that was there as a difference, a point of difference that I had, and probably had some significant aspects and impacts through my education and my work. But also I have developed a lot of tools and techniques to still get me going and how I try and manage it so that I can find ways around it. But yeah, it's been a really interesting journey to diagnosis and understanding. Well, the understanding's still coming.
Yes, it does take time to understand. I remember after I got diagnosed, people say, well, what do you need? I'm like, well, I don't really know yet. I don't know until I understand how this all works for me. So how did you feel being diagnosed later in adulthood? Some people say that it's a relief. So some it's a point of grief and challenges.
I think for me, it was a relief in that it explained a lot. There's probably a little bit of grief. I had a lot of grief with the boys when they were diagnosed because of the recognition of the impact that would have on their lives, and you have an expectation of what your life with children may be like, and suddenly you're on a very different path. For me, finding out I was dyslexic, I think really did just explain a lot and became quite helpful to understand why I seem to be in such a different place compared to other people and why they could find things a lot easier than I found them. There is the grief as well about why it was different, and maybe if I'd had intervention and diagnosis earlier, would that have made the educational process a bit easier?
Yes, because you're highly qualified and highly skilled and highly talented. So you've been able to navigate many achievements. But yes, you do wonder, what if I'd had that bit of extra support? And it's so common, dyslexia and ADHD. And it's not really talked about enough. And whether it's just because everyone kind of has a leading diagnosis first, and so the rest kind of get not talked about as much, or there's just not a lot of research. But we talk to many people that have a dual diagnosis of dyslexia and ADHD. And I'm nearly finished through that journey of being assessed myself now. And I think I feel like you, I've had the grief with my dyslexia, and then when I get my ADHD diagnosis, it's more, oh, well, that makes sense. Why I'm so disorganized. And my room was always so messy. And still is, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I certainly think having questions about does a diagnosis change things, and when I talk to other women who are saying, I wonder whether to go back and get formally diagnosed for ADHD, or, I don't know whether I want to get my kids diagnosed for autism. I don't want them labelled. But in some ways, you're still the same person. And I think that's really important. For me, in having the label, it does then help to go, well, it's a journey then about what can I now find to help me with this. So maybe people don't want that, but I find in having it, it then allows to go, okay, great, well, now I can go and have all these tools and techniques, rather than over my life I have developed I make lists. If it's really important, I print it out and I check it with a ruler to slow me down enough. But with the diagnosis, I'm now interested to see actually what else is out there that I didn't have to come up with myself. What tools are there to help and to support me?
Well, we can definitely show you some online tools where you don't have to print anymore, that still has a ruler for you.
Oh, good.
It is just Microsoft Immersive Reader is the easiest one. I'll send you a link to how you set it up if you haven't also already done that. But that blocks it out, so it can be a line, it can be 3 lines, it can be 5 lines. And that's one of the first steps when I work with the client, is setting them up on that, because it's free and it's easy to use. And anyway, we wouldn't talk about strategies so much, unless there's strategies you'd like to talk about. But thank you for sharing that, because it's not always easy starting to share your story, especially if you're diagnosed later in life, I feel. Well, I can't speak for young people who have been diagnosed early and happy to talk about it. I just know what it's been like for myself and for other adults I talk to. And I think the reason we wanted to talk today was to share your story, and also to talk about, when we end up in leadership roles, how can we make other people feel comfortable and safe to talk about their differences? And it's all differences. It's not just being neurodivergent, so that we can encourage people to be able to share and to be their authentic, true selves. So how do you think we can create a safer space for neurodivergent women to start sharing their stories, particularly in the leadership space? Because I feel like we see a lot of men talking about being neurodivergent and those strengths that they see in themselves. We don't see women so much. I think particularly in the dyslexic space or women that have dyslexia and ADHD. Do you think there's things we could do?
I think there's a lot that we can do in a broad sense that supports inclusivity. And so I think that starting from that base point of you will have people in your organisation who are neurodiverse, whether you know it or not and whether they know it or not. So it's almost flipping the view of how do we accommodate this person or that person, and even just saying we need to be having a space that is neuro-inclusive, because once you've got more than 10 people in your organisation, statistically you've got someone. And then I think having that approach then becomes a lot more enabling to say, well, actually setting aside how can we support you to be effective at work? What's that look like? How do you learn? How do you take information in? Would you like it verbal? Would you like it written? And as organisations, encouraging people to have that reflection and self-awareness, they don't necessarily have to be those big formal accommodations, which isn't to say that's wrong. Yes, we should also be making those adjustments as appropriate. But I think almost flipping it to say, for each of my staff members, how do we support them in being their best self at work? And that, I think, makes a change. I think there's also some really simple things that you can do in showing that. So one of the things that we have done is actually change the footer of our Teams invites that just say, we are an inclusive organisation. If you need any adjustments, let us know. And then that enables us to, people are a bit more comfortable then if they need to say, yep, this isn't, I need something different. Because sometimes a phone call may be better than a Teams meeting for some people. And another thing that I've started to do is in face-to-face meetings, just be neuro-affirming and acknowledge that. Encourage people to get up and move around if they need to move around, which again is not specifically a neurodiverse thing. That's also important for, there's a whole range of people who have a bad back or something like that they want to get up and move around. And so just building in that safe space and that comfort. And so that comes to that idea of universal design, that it's not just for people who are dyslexic or people who have ADHD, but it works for all. Another thing that I will do in meetings is actually check that everyone's sitting where they can hear, because sometimes people come into the meetings at different points and, some people hear better out of one ear than the other, and you can have much better engagement when people are in the right place. So I think there's a lot that we can do in creating those safe spaces for people. Then the challenge is about what's that look like as a leader. So as a leader, living that is really important, and being inclusive, that's very important as well.
And what has the response been? Have you noticed any feedback? Have you had any feedback around those adjustments, or is it just BAU?
Definitely in terms of the movement in rooms, that really makes people open to it. I've not had any on the Teams meetings, and so I don't know whether that's because no one needs it or they're not comfortable, but certainly the rooms has been good, and occasionally we might swap people around so that they can hear better.
And if we're thinking of leadership and inclusive practices, if you're a neurodivergent leader, do you find that sometimes your neurodivergence can impact on the team? And are there any strategies you put in for yourself to make sure that you're effective in your leadership?
So some of that is around putting the tools and techniques to make sure that I do, classic ADHD, actually finish the task, or work with someone who's going to be able to, recognise that's something I find difficult. And if whatever that task is, do I actually need someone who's better suited to the finishing to help me with that? And that works, again, for not just neurodivergence, but, everybody's different. So there's the challenge of playing to your strengths, but also understanding where your weaknesses are and what you do to manage that. So there is that challenge of keeping track of the tasks and making sure I do deliver them and keep them on time, or if I have, important things that someone else reads over them before they go out in case there's various things that I haven't seen that are there. So there is a challenge as a leader about how that impacts the team, but also there are the strengths that you may not recognise as well that come from the neurodiversity. And so for me, one of the ones that I really didn't recognise until I got it through a leadership course as part of the feedback was the energy that I bring. And I was like, oh, okay, I would never have stated that as a strength. So I think getting that feedback as a leader, being really open to getting that feedback is important because it can be both positive and help you to identify strengths that you weren't aware of, and also understanding where the friction points are in the team.
At Rethink Dyslexia, we are doing things differently. As a global leader in creating inclusive environments for adults with dyslexia, our commitment is to provide individuals with opportunities to live healthier, happier, and more connected lives. Through our range of tailored services, including coaching, learning and development programs, consultancy, and training, we're helping dyslexic individuals, businesses, and organisations to better understand and support their dyslexic employees. So if you're looking for insights, inspiration, and expert advice on dyslexia and how you can provide inclusive practices and environments, then head to rethinkdyslexia.com to find out more or book your free consultation today. Did you find that after you found out you were dyslexic, that does the medication help some of your dyslexic that you thought, because some of our dyslexic traits cross over with ADHD, so do you feel that having the medication helps support some of those dyslexic difficulties as well? Or they keep very separate?
I don't know that they're very separate, but I hadn't really thought about it. I do think that the medication helps with the techniques that I have to manage the dyslexia, yes, because it helps with the focus then, keeping me on target.
Do you see, because I've always thought that like all the different difficulties I have are related to dyslexia, but can you pull apart like what the ADHD kind of difficulties are and what the dyslexia difficulties are? Can you see a difference, or do they really cross over quite strongly for you?
I think there's a small overlap because the dyslexia is definitely around processing written information, but the ADHD can also just be getting stuff done, sitting still, staying on task.
Yeah. And it might be a weird question because we're just talking about leadership and then back to leadership. But I guess medication is a strategy. And so it's a really positive one for many people. So it's like, how do you incorporate them all, and can you see differences in improvement in the way that you do things across your neurodivergence, I guess is what I was trying to
Yeah, that's right. And I do think it probably does help. I don't know that it is, you take it for dyslexia, but given that they are sort of together, I'm sure it does help in the tools to keep me focused, to implement the tools that I need to implement to manage the challenges around producing high quality outputs for my clients with dyslexia.
Yes, because we don't have any medication support. And purely because I've always said it's a reading, writing difficulty. So that's not related to what happens with ADHD. But I was just interested to know. So my brain was going off on a complete tangent. Sorry. So I think that like in the water sector, I know there's some companies doing some really great work at the moment around supporting neurodivergent employees. And when we had the conference, we heard some great case studies. Do you think that there's more we could be doing to kind of leverage the types of talents that neurodivergent employees could bring to the water sector? Like what kind of talents do you think that we're missing out on that we could be tapping into?
I think definitely we're missing out on, I think there's a lot of out of the box sort of thinking that people who are and neurodivergence is a massive area, but I do think, particularly with the dyslexia, for me, what I think when I reflect on my childhood and my learning, part of what I think the dyslexia contributed to is filling in information gaps. So I think I am better at dealing with ambiguity and a lack of information than neurotypical people because I've had to adapt to that. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing. And I think because we don't know what's in other people's brains, we may not actually recognise the strength of that sort of thing, whether it's a pattern matching piece or being a more creative thinker, not necessarily in a, like, I can't write creatively to save my life, but I can come up with, and sometimes I frustrate people because I can come up with 5 different reasons why something might be happening. And they're like, no, it's really obvious, it's X. And you're like, no, it could be this or this. And that sort of innovative thinking, I think, can be really helpful. And it also potentially, can lead to better empathy because you can put yourself, come up with a lot of reasons why someone may not be performing really well. So it helps you to then connect and unpack with them where they might be. Well, this is rubbish. So I think there are those sort of strengths, particularly, I think, with the dyslexia, that where the things that you've built to compensate for the fact that information isn't coming and you're trying to make do with less information, and the adaptations certainly I'd come up with do become a strength.
I find that I just go to problem. I can give 5 solutions to one problem. For me, it's like I probably need to listen more to what the problem is before I try. But my brain just automatically, and my best friend does it, like, oh, can you just listen to the problem first? It's like the brain automatically goes to like all these different ways that you could readjust something or redo things differently, which I've always found interesting that my brain does that. So with the neurodivergent team members then, it comes back to that strengths-based approach for everyone, doesn't it? And trying to look at how we can be more inclusive for everyone rather than just because neurodivergence is such a huge umbrella now.
Look, it is. And I think that strengths-based approach is very powerful across the organisation and really finding out what works for the other people, when they work effectively, how they want information given to them. And there is a tension within a workplace that I want you to do something. It is given as a task with a deadline throughout. Look, that's what we do. But there's that process. But there's a whole lot that supports that process. I don't expect you to take one little line item and go and do it. So then you've got formal structures within an organisation. But then the question is, well, having assigned that task to you formally through our system, how do I then communicate to your strengths? What time of day, what mode, do you want to read it first and then we'll chat about it? Do you want to chat about it first and then read it? There's lots, finding that out really lets us get the best from people.
It was a bit like this morning, we had the podcast scheduled for this morning when my brain was fresh. And I can see that it's declining quickly this afternoon. And I've known for, I don't know how many, few months now to get these submissions in. And of course, I left it till today to do. So then by the afternoon, my brain's gone. So it's, how do you work at your best and knowing that your energy levels dip? And I mean, again, everyone's energy levels dip throughout the day. But I think it's just that there's that overlay of complexity that we have to manage that others don't. And time management is one of them.
I think time management is one. And also the challenge of making sure that within that time management about having those times to recharge becomes important as well. And understanding that may be different for other people who aren't having to have that extra cognitive load to manage.
It's interesting because cognitively, I know I'm fatigued, but I'll keep pushing through. But physically now my back, like this week, I've been sitting at my desk for longer periods. And I can't cope with that back pain, but I'll push through my fatigue and just collapse at the end of the day. Because it seems to be, it's more acceptable to have a physical pain that you need to manage and make sure you stretch and walk and stand up for. But there doesn't seem to be the allowance at the moment for that cognitive fatigue. And whether it's just there's a lack of understanding about it, I'm not sure.
I think there is a real lack of understanding broadly about non-physical disability and neurodiversity. And as an example, my son with his ADHD, he just needs to touch everything. He goes into people's houses and he just touches everything. And that's very difficult for people. And yet, if he was blind, that would be fine, right? That would be perfectly understandable that he's blind and therefore he is touching everything. So I think it's very difficult with hidden disabilities and whether neurodiversity sits at some of that and then goes off in its own space. But that non-physical side, I think, is much easier to dismiss, and that's not helpful. And it's challenging also in terms of the supports, because there's a sense about, we've got you a support. Okay, great. You're a lot better now, so we'll take that support away. And yet, if it was a physical disability, there'd never be an expectation that having got you a cane or a wheelchair, that now your mobility's improved and you don't need that support anymore. I think that is a challenge, and it's something that certainly as leaders we do need to be advocating for, and leaders and advocates, but really sort of saying these supports, some of them may be skill building, but others of them are actually for life.
Yeah, and it's not a lifestyle choice. Like my family thinks it's a lifestyle choice to have a nap.
Right.
Everyone, people that have listened to my podcast for years know how I love to nap. But my dad, because he gets up very early and he's very neurodivergent, but he'll always have an afternoon nap on the couch, and that's acceptable. But to go to bed and have a sleep, or to sleep in the mornings, that's perceived as lazy. And what are you doing? And why are you in bed? And so it's really interesting to see how people perceive these different things as wrong or not appropriate for hidden disabilities. So I think having the opportunity to talk with yourself and with others, hopefully we can start to shift those perceptions, because sleep is very important.
Yeah. Well, and I had a chuckle when we were traveling and we went to Spain, and you're like, I could really get used to this lifestyle of, let's just have a chilled out period in the afternoon after lunch. You're like, this is great. Why don't we do this?
And do you find you can? Because I find that my brain just, and I don't know whether it's just a change with COVID and we're used to being on screens more, but I just find that my brain just cannot stop. And I'll sit there and in my head, I'm like, my brain's really bored. And I'm like, but you just need to sit and relax because you're fatigued. But unless I'm sleeping, it won't stop.
Right, yes. I might nap on the weekend. I don't tend not to during the week because it's just too, I couldn't wind down. But there is some really interesting neuroscience around the Zoom fatigue as well, which I find fascinating. And so that was, some of the advice was, if you don't need to do it face-to-face, don't. Like as a video, if you don't need to do a video, you should actually do it as a phone call, because the audio quality is better and your brain isn't expecting a whole lot of information that it's not getting, and that's why you get Zoom fatigue, because you're trying to get information that's not available over Zoom. Whereas if you're on a phone call, you're not expecting a whole lot of other information. I found that fascinating.
Yeah, and is there something also about just looking at yourself all the time?
Possibly that too.
It's quite fatiguing looking at how you look all the time when you talk and when you do things.
Well, and I think that the challenge is also that it's not natural, because you're not looking at people's eyes. You're missing a lot of communication. I find it very challenging. I'm a real hand speaker, and now I have to work in this tiny space to try and explain really big concepts in really small movements. Whereas in a room, people laugh and say, "Oh, you're bringing the plane in, right?" So I think being online is a challenging thing, and it is good to think about, are there other ways that we can do it rather than having to sit in a meeting like this? Should we be doing it by phone, or even when we're in the office, should we be going for a walk together?
Yes, well, even just I find having to manage emails, writing reports, being on a Slack channel and a team channel, it's all written. And I just can't cope. As sometimes I'll say to my team, if it's going on Slack for more than 3, people commenting or something, please pick up the phone, because I just can't, I can't manage the trail of conversation. I get really lost in it. And if you hop out for it, all of a sudden there's these 50 messages. If it's worth 50 messages, just talk to someone.
Yes. Yeah.
Unless it's chit chat, then tell me I don't need to be part of it. If it's something important, then pick up the phone, because I just get lost in the thread. And if you're checking all these multiple channels to see who's communicating where, in the end, I just have to shut it all down, because I can't cope with the beeping, the flashing of notification. I can't have a notification on my phone before I go to bed. Can't cope with that red dot.
Right.
Which is dangerous, because I read emails late and go, address that in the morning, and then I miss them because I've read them the night before, and then there's a whole new heap of emails. But yes, there's definitely some pros and cons from working from home, but particularly for me, I love it because I can normally have my lights off now and it's quiet. I don't cope in the office with all the noise anymore. All the background noise, I can't concentrate. But I feel like we've gone around in this big circle today. Sorry, that's partly my mental fatigue. I was switched on this morning already, but it would be great to have a chat with you again as you go through your journey, and if there's parts you want to share with the community. I think it's really fantastic to have people like yourself on to share lived experience about ADHD and dyslexia, which is so common. And we need to be talking more about it as leaders, I think, in this space. So I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me and happy to share my journey.
Are there any last words you'd like to say to any leaders out there, neurodivergent or not neurodivergent?
I think the call to action is about building those inclusive communities. I think that's the really powerful call to action because it will work for everyone.
Well, that is a great way to finish on a Friday afternoon. So thank you so much. And I hope we get to have another coffee in Melbourne or Sydney in the near future.
Yes, I hope so.
So thank you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks everyone for listening. Bye for now.
If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we are doing at Rethink Dyslexia. So head to rethinkdyslexia.com.au. And don't forget, if there's anything you heard today that was distressing, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Thanks for listening and bye for now.
Oh, yeah.